There has been a lot of talk recently about the end of the American empire, the end of Pax Americana, the end of the world order that we know and live under, and while it may seem like this video is made in reaction to the war in Ukraine or the gross shocks to the energy industry that we've seen recently, in reality, this video is being made because of fundamental shifts in the power balance of the world that exist behind the scenes and the way in which these shifts occur. Ray Dalio is hardly an uncontroversial figure at this point. Some people hate him because they think he's a greedy capitalist with no regard for human decency who has sold his soul to the devil. Others hate him because they see him as a greedy communist with no regard for human decency who has sold his soul to the CCP. But today we're going to try and put all of that behind us and talk simply about Ray Dalio's belief that the United States of America is in decline, that its time as the world #1 megapower is over, and that it's all because of one seemingly innocent detail that we are seeing, reading and writing an awful lot about right now. This is the collapse of the American empire and why Ray Dalio thinks it's really already started. So if you're not sure where this video is coming from, then you probably haven't seen this video by Ray Dalio, which goes into great detail explaining how financial markets and strong economies go hand in hand with worldwide hegemons. In the video, Dalio gives us a brief explanation of how markets work, how they're used to finance growth and expansion, and how capitalism itself was really the invention of the Dutch Empire as a way to expand and build wealth. Following this, Dalio goes on to look at the other empires that dominated the world, the British Empire and now the American Empire that has followed, and he considers their financial markets, but then he looks at the declines of those empires and what he believes characterizes every single one of them.
To focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
Now it seems clear what Dalio's point of view is, and it's actually really hard to argue against him here. Excessive debt and a perpetually weakening currency is a surefire way to kill an empire. It's simply a matter of time. And that really brings us on to the present day, what we are seeing happening right now as we speak, and what that means for us in the future. It's no secret that over the last 2 years, more money has been printed in the United States than at any other point in history, and this really isn't actually limited to just the US. It's easy then for people to think and propagate the idea that this change in monetary policy came about as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns, and this is not the case. The reality is, it's just far easier to justify the gross behaviour of our governments when taking into account the extraordinary circumstances we found ourselves in. A pandemic swept across the world, millions were killed, and governments in almost every single country sought to stop the spread of this virus by basically shutting everything down. Schools, nurseries, and universities closed their doors. Shops, cinemas, and theatres did so as well. Offices banned their employees from coming into work, and local governments poured sand over skate parks to stop children from playing outside. I'll be frank here when I say that hysteria took control, and I personally think that the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021 will not be looked back on fondly, but that really isn't the question of topic for today. The money printing that went on during these extraordinary times is what we are consumed by because it was so huge. As shops were forced to close, businesses ran out of income, and people stopped getting paid, the money printer was turned on to keep our world running without the productivity which usually keeps everything turning. Now, there are those who argue that those restrictions should have never been put into place, and there are those who argue that the money printing shouldn't have happened either. But what we don't see are people arguing that the restrictions should have happened, but the monetary support that went alongside it should have been held back, and that's for good reason. What kind of a government will threaten a business owner to stop working under threat of imprisonment and then refuse to help them pay their bills? The loose monetary policy over the last 2 years has largely been justified then on the idea that it was necessary, and the governments which have propagated this policy for far longer than just the last 2 years have lent on that justification to ensure their previous actions aren't held up to scrutiny. But that's the real problem here. The fact that this process of throwing money out of helicopters didn't actually start in 2020 or even in 2019. It started over a decade ago with the onset of the global financial crisis and the quantitative easing that followed, and this is really where the American empire started to actually decline.
The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money, at first gradually and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce the tectonic shifts that realign the new waters to the new realities of wealth and power in the world. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance. For the British, this happened after World War II, when despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing, devaluations, and sell-offs in the British pound, as the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order.
The reality here is, we don't know at what point of this cycle the American empire is in, and while the tendency to print more and more money and spend more irresponsibly than ever before and create larger financial bubbles than ever before might give us some clues, they aren't actually enough to predict the future. Dalio's point of view seems to be that the US is already significantly declining, and that the Chinese are growing so much stronger so quickly that within a few years they will take over as the world power, maybe with some kind of awful catastrophic war acting as a singular point of change. Personally though, this is where I'm left unconvinced by what Dalio has to say, and it's also where his biases have to be considered. It's no secret that Dalio is a fan of the Chinese Communist Party. He's defended them and their morally abhorrent views more times than I can count, and he's positioned himself to profit off of the rise of China as well. He secured special privileges from the CCP decades ago to invest in their country and grow rich alongside them. But what Dalio doesn't talk about during this is the fact that if the US is in decline due to their excessive debt, their aging population, their declining competitiveness as wages rise, and their government spending too much, then China must also be failing because it's also seeing those exact same problems. Now this is unfortunately a topic far too long for this video alone, and we will cover it in huge amounts of detail in the future, but in short, China is in a worse position with its debt obligations than the US is. Last year, we saw a singular point of chaos as Evergrande failed to repay its debt and the Chinese housing market started a major decline, which is still ongoing. But as that was now 6 months ago, many people are laughing at what we were so scared of, convinced that no news is good news, but that just isn't the case. Property prices in China have been falling by about 1% every month. The Chinese Hang Seng Index is continued to decline and is currently sitting far lower than it ever dropped during the height of the Evergrande drama. Bond prices across the entirety of China have continued to collapse as well, as every day it seems more and more clear that these bonds, this debt, will never be repaid. People expected a singular day of chaos in China, where literally everything would fall apart overnight, but that was never going to happen. Right from the beginning, China's collapse has been a slow burner. It started not in September when we were all reading about Evergrande, but a year prior to that, when the Three Red Lines policy was first put into place. Dalio's argument that America might be in decline does stand up to reason, and it is a scary prospect and something that needs to be addressed. But during the entirety of that 40-minute video where he outlines his thesis, he is subtly suggesting that as America falls and gets everything wrong, China is rising and getting everything right, and that's something which just isn't backed up by the truth. One brilliant example of this is Dalio's views on China that are characterized by this short clip.
The most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich."
Dalio fails to recognize that Xi Jinping is not Deng Xiaoping, and the Chinese system right now is not catching any mice, black or white. It is crumbling apart as the Chinese state exercises more and more control over the businesses whose independence are the only reason China ever saw this gross amount of wealth in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like and comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world-famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support. Thanks for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.